So that's probably right. Um, so hello there, folks. My name is CJ Woodford. I am a co-chair of the Global Open Research Commons International Implementations Working Group. And I'm going to be joined by Rory McNeil, who has been also a co-author of the model and a very dear colleague who's a co-chair of the Maldrith Working Group, Maldrith 2 Working Group. Sorry, both groups went into their second version around the same time. And we're going to be sharing the presentation. So I'll let Rory introduce himself as well, but I work for the Digital Research Alliance of Canada. And we're going to be talking today about our 12-month update for this working group. We only have another about 6 months left to go. For anyone who's already in the working group, that might seem stressful, and I assure you it is also stressful to us, the co-chairs. Roy, did you want to introduce yourself now or when we get to your slides?
Well, I'll just do it quickly now to get it out of the way so we don't
Sure.
take time later on. Hi, I think everyone more or less knows me, but I'm Rory McNeil, work for Research Base, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the of Maldrith 2 working group. And as TJ said, we've been doing a lot of. We had a really good meeting of Maldrith. I think it was on Tuesday. Francoise was there, and yeah, and we've been making great progress on, as we'll talk about later on, I think in terms of looking at interaction and not only collaboration between GORC and Maldrith, which has been going on informally for a couple of years, but also how the two models can actually actively work together.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So I'll get us started. I'm going to put the collaborative notes in the chat one more time. Please go in there to find the links for everything that we'll be talking about today, as well as to sign in. Reminder, if you haven't seen this before, welcome to new RDA members. I'm really grateful if you decided to join the session in the breakout. We'll be following, of course, the 6 guiding principles of the RDA community. And we encourage, if you haven't already, to register as a member of RDA, and then, of course, to maybe consider joining the GORC 2 working group. And by extension, the Wellness 2 working group. So today we're going to be going over an overview of the outputs that already exist, so the GORC typology of essential elements and the international commons model. We'll talk a little bit about connections to other work, in particular reviewing how we're doing compared to the last plenary and what we saw was needed, and some of our task force and task group updates. If you aren't aware of the GORC 2 working group and kind of how the first GORC working group went as well, we've been breaking out the work into task forces or task groups. There is a difference, and we'll get to what that means. So we'll get a little bit of update from that, and then we'll move into the current state of adoption tools, just to remind folks how you can currently use the outputs in different ways and for different purposes, and also some of the new things that have occurred over the last little while. And if I can, I'll show a quick demo depending on time. And then we'll move into kind of the meat of the meeting, which is more about the discussions, proposed changes to the model, and in particular, an update from the Maldrith Task Force and a discussion on the representation of interoperability in both the model and the typology. Both things have been very, very active discussions over the last, I'm going to say, 6 months or so. So I'm really excited to showcase what's going on with those. And then lastly, we'll open up into a discussion, kind of like a free-form discussion on how the model maybe is useful now for the community, if that's changed, and if there's anything different that might influence our last 6 months of the work plan. So first and foremost, welcome. The International Implementations Working Group, as I kind of mentioned, is the second working group for the GORC initiative, and it's coordinated through the GORC interest group. So both groups currently exist. They both have members. So please, whichever one you'd like to join or both, that's all good. And this working group is intended to maintain the recommendation of the GORC typology and the International Commons model that was created through the GORC International Model Working Group. So the first thing we'd like to know is who's here and what do you know about GORC? And so we will first start with a Menti, and I will put that in the chat. Then if you already have the slides, you can go ahead and click in, and then I will start it. Too many windows, folks, sorry. All right, so this is the Menti for the introduction. So you can go ahead and click in there. Oh, sorry, this is the right link. Don't use the first one. I was thinking that first one looked a little long. I'll delete that, delete message, make that easier. So you can go ahead and join the Menti. It should already be open. If you can't use the link for whatever reason, there is a QR code here if you'd like to join on your phone. Alternatively, you can go to menti.com and enter the code on the screen. Um, so whatever works there. See, there's already 17 people in here. There's 15 people in the chat. Question mark. Okay. We'll consider that maybe full then. Nice. Good job, everybody. All right. So we'll start these questions. All right. So have you heard of basically the GORC initiative before? You have the first working group, second working group, the outputs, the interest group. 9 people have. That's already a majority. Nice. All right, we got 13. I haven't seen any no's or not sure's come in. So that's good. So most people know what's going on here. That's awesome. All right, the second one is more about who's calling in. I have a feeling this is mostly going to be Europe and Australia, but please definitely share where you're calling in from. Australia. Okay, the Australians were so fast. Thank you. Nice. Big representation from France. Amazing. Ooh, and the Netherlands because someone forgot the or added the depending on how you guys normally say it, but um also a good representation from the Netherlands. All right, nice, thank you. And then another question about the perspective that you're bringing to this session. So, what sort of organization are you from? We've broken them out into, and as people can see them, funder, research institute slash university, service provider, government, or other. And if you feel like that you're in the other category, please do put in the chat what kind of organization you are from so that I can maybe update this for the next round and we can consider different perspectives as we build some of the work outputs. Oh, one person said others. So definitely put in the chat what you think. And if you don't want everyone to see it, you can send me a personal message through the chat too. That's also fine. We'll move on to the next one. And this is another word cloud. What do you think when you hear the word commons? And for a lot of you, because you've already heard of the GORC initiative before, this might be skewed, but still interested in your thoughts there. All right, shared has gotten a couple, collaboration, um, referring back to interest groups within RDA. All right, infrastructure, vision. Oh, so these are really interesting. Okay. Mutualization. I don't even think I've seen that word before. So thank you for adding that to my vocabulary. I appreciate it. Equity. I really like that one. Thank you. Um, all right. So it looks like we're kind of stabilizing around shared interoperability, lots of things about standards and collaboration. Thank you for this. It's great. And then any areas you're interested in learning more about. And so for some of the folks in the audience, I know that you're already in task groups and task forces, so some of this is definitely going to be skewed. But I encourage you to give a ranking of what maybe you're most interested in seeing in the next 6 months. That would be really helpful for us. So even if it's not a task group or task force you're currently in, or even one that you're necessarily interested in participating in, what would you be interested in learning more about or seeing out of the GORC working group in the next 6 months? That would be a helpful thing to think about. All right, so mapping is ahead by a little bit. Oh, and I spoke too soon. That's what happens. I am surprised to see user documentation all the way at the bottom, but I think that might be because the group is already pretty aware of the initiative, so that's fair. We'll leave it maybe for another few seconds. All right, well, this is a pretty good set. Thank you, folks. Um, So mostly interested in mapping implementation profiles. That usually are things that come up most often. So that's consistent. And then moving into visualizations and thematic support. Okay, nice. Thank you. All right, and then just a reminder to log in and add to the collaborative notes. That's in the I'll put that in the chat again. If we've had new people join, that's the Menti. Sorry. Collaborative notes. Here we go. To make sure to sign in, and you could also find the link to the slides. All right, so thank you for that. Really, really appreciate your engagement with the mentee and letting us know who's here. So I'll quickly go through what the purpose of the GORC2 working group is. Um, we want to identify and define the implementations of the GORC international model. So this is looking at what we would call profiles. So hopefully organizations or groups of organizations or or uh, entities that are interested in the GORC model that would benefit from using the GORC outputs generally and what they are using it for, as well as any implementations that are specific to them, like say the frameworks they're using, the policies they have to abide by, the approaches they need to do, the standards and conventions they have to adopt or that they are adopting or developing to achieve these goals. That would be captured in something called a profile. And so we're interested in capturing that so that folks can find each other that are similar and also to share what some of these solutions can be. We want to improve the usability of the outputs themselves. So that includes things like creating an interactive container, documentation, thematic subsets of the model, and mappings to existing frameworks, models, vocabulary, and principles, which we also saw was one of the main things folks are interested in. So that's good. And then the third main deliverable is to ensure that the model is continued to be updated. So it is a model, it's not a framework or a blueprint. It's not going to have context-specific implementation recommendations in the model itself. That's what some of the other outputs are for. But making sure that the content of the model and the structure of the model are still helpful, usable, and up to date with the current reality. So those are our three main deliverables for this group. The outputs that we have to date and what we're looking at maintaining in the GORC2 working group include the GORC typology, which is what defines the essential elements. There's a QR code here on the screen, but there's also links in the notes. And what the typology did is it defined what is a research commons, as well as the essential elements needed to kind of be or create a research commons. The human or social elements are in white along the top of this diagram. The technical ones are in blue along the bottom, and there's a central element of standards and interoperability. We'll actually get to the interoperability discussion a little bit later, and you'll notice that this particular diagram is not one we should be using anymore based on the decisions from the working group. So take that with a grain of salt, but their interoperability should actually be on that central hexagon. We also have the international model. So the essential elements are really helpful. They kind of identify these large buckets of work or consideration. But what they don't do is but they're not very granular. They're very high level. And so the international model was intended to dive down into the essential elements and not just identify what a research comment is, but the kind of considerations within each of those buckets they might want to consider when building. So it's getting more towards the how do you actually implement the elements themselves. It is in a spreadsheet. There's a narrative version to help create profiles as well as the web graph version. And I'll show the web graph very quickly. And again, all the links are in the slide there. Um, but when you come in, you might see a blank screen. If you do, you go to settings and you select the model. So you say, yes, I want to see GORC, and yes, I want to see GORC. And then you can select slices to look at subsections of the model. So for example, research objects. And if you click an item, it'll tell you more about it, what kind of item it is, whether it's a essential element or a subcategory or a characteristic. And what's nice as of I think today or yesterday is there's been an addition of what children or parents are in each item. And if available, the KPIs or metrics that are associated with it, because the model wasn't just what you might implement, it was also um, a set of key performance indicators and metrics that could be included. So there's lots of things here to explore if you like the more graphic version, but it is also still available in a spreadsheet and as an RDA recommendation. Um, yeah, Micah, so then now you see the interface. There you go. All right, so outcomes from the last plenary, P25 or International Data Week, which was in Brisbane, Australia. So in July of 2025, and we've been talking about this now for almost a year, but there was a little Lorenz workshop. It was a pretty pivotal moment for the GORC initiative. I think there was a lot of things that came out of that that really influenced the rest of the work from the working group that we're currently in, but then also kind of highlighted some higher level things that needed to be done in terms of governance and sustainability. So really was very pivotal for us. And you can see the full set of recommendations. The link is there. And the report was recently re-released as a very glossy, shiny version, thanks to the graphic design support from SIR in the Netherlands. And so some of the main things that came out of P25 that we should really think about when it came to the Lawrence workshop was looking at adopter registry development. So a place where folks that are using the GORC model or the GORC initiatives can actually say that they're doing that or highlight why they're using it, how they're using it, put in the materials that they developed through that use. If they can, or even if it's a redacted version or reduced version, at least it would be something to share with the community that they're comfortable with sharing. Um, so that's the adopter registry, a proposal for representation of interoperability, which we'll discuss today. And these numbers, by the way, are the recommended improvements to the model, improvements to the initiative. So I3, I6, I7, those are all the different numbers that we had of recommendations. Getting stakeholder profiles started, mappings and the organizational technical elements, and then continue in the task groups and task forces. So there's a lot of numbers missing between I3 and I6 and between that and I10 and all the way up to I20. So we're not hitting all of the Lawrence Workshop recommendations, but we are hitting some of them. And so we're going to continue to try and achieve what we can within the working group. We needed to investigate whether it's possible to generate a DOI for specific model profiles. So right now there's two. There's a version 1 and a version 1.1. And then there's also the profiles that will be created, which would then be used, say, in the adopter registry. So we want to make sure that we're minting and kind of walking the walk, as you will. And this one is just not started. We don't have that adopter registry up and running, and so having a PID associated with it has been left as a priority, but we definitely want to make sure that's the case when we're ready. And then lastly, clarify what we mean by open. The meaning of each word in the GORC acronym was kind of outlaid in the workshop recommendations, but we want to make sure, but we want to also encapsulate what's these approaching security concerns. And if that maybe is done through something else, like a different output, like a slice. And so this is suggested as a thematic slice that we would take through the model. So all the things across the essential elements that would pertain to security concerns, and maybe that would be divvied down by stakeholder group and that sort of thing. But ultimately, we just don't have the capacity to start that work right now. So it was proposed, but we didn't have enough working group members sign up for it. So we have to put that one on the back burner, but it is still on the blue sky list. So that's kind of how we're doing. We're doing pretty good with the Lawrence Workshop recommendations, and the other things need to get a little bit more work done, but they all kind of relate to each other. So we're getting there. Moving into task force updates. So what have we been able to do within these task forces and task groups? Um, so the first task group profiles, this one we realized it didn't make sense for all these different groups that had very different contexts to come to work together necessarily in a direct fashion. So this is decentralized. We're focusing instead on the adopter registry and making the use cases and profiles more accessible and findable. So folks are working on this on their own with their own organizations. And so the task group doesn't exist as a task group anymore. Task group 2 and 5 combined, it was realized that model representation and mapping were kind of needed each other. To do mappings, we kind of needed to update the model container and create some semantic objects around it. And so it was also the same people that were interested, so that worked out. We were on a pause, but we're going to start again in April, and we're focusing on firming up the identifiers for each item in the model, as well as completing mappings to the Portra Seal certification, the International Data Spaces Association reference architecture model protocol and rulebook, and also some data infrastructure vocabularies and interoperability models. I will say that if you're interested in data spaces in particular, there's also a data spaces BOF for a hopeful interest group happening in the next breakout session later today. Task group 3 for model documentation. This one now is revamped, and we're working asynchronously on consolidating value narratives to identify stakeholder profiles, which is also an active piece of homework for the working group out on the large, because we want to make sure that these things are coming in and out of the working group. For task group 4 for slices, this one also got revamped. There was renewed interest, and we've got subgroups working on artificial intelligence and legal and organizational interoperability. That'll likely expand into other kinds of interoperability, but at least we have a place to start. So the task forces are liaisons between the GORC International Implementations Working Group and at least one other working group or interest group. One example is the National Data Spaces Task Force, which is with the National the National Data Services Interest Group, which is about National Data Services and how that relates to the GORC model. So this is a continuing collection of national data service provider profiles. There's a number that's already been worked on and collected. And part of this is to help identify a possible national data service definition, and ideally maybe a GORC profile template at the same time. I know that there's a couple of people here from that task force. Did anyone want to speak to this? And it's okay if not. It's all right. It's a good summary. All right, I don't see any hands. Okay, that's fine. And then what we'll be going into more today is the Maldrith Task Force, which is connecting with the Maldrith 2 working group to find connections between the two models. And so you will hear more about this, but we've confirmed some high-level connections. We've seen a split between research-facing and enabling services, which was also a recommendation from the Lawrence Workshop, and we'll get more into that in a second. If you are interested in joining a task group or a task force, please do email me. These groups are underway, and so it's not really possible to hop in directly. So let me know. My email is in the slides, and I'll put it in the chat here too. And I'm very happy to connect you with the person leading that particular task group or task force and get you up to speed. All right. Lastly, adoption tools, and I see there's some stuff in the chat about this too, which is great. We do have a set of communiques to describe the GORC outputs and its intended use. It's now available in English and French, although I'll put a little asterisk on the French for my Parisian friends that are here. It's Canadian French, so you might find it may not match Parisian French perfectly, but I hope it's better than nothing. And that was created by CRDCN in Canada. We're also working on Spanish and Portuguese translations, which have kind of been in their final draft version for a while, but not quite ready to go. We also even have a French version of the typology diagram. So for the English and French versions, there's pretty much everything you need. We still have a flexible narrative profile template, which we encourage users to use to identify the purpose and approach when they're thinking about using the model. connect it to their context, and consider their current state and objectives during the analysis. So that one kind of helps you walk through. Oh, what? And another way that you can go about this when you're ready to dive in a little further, you've confirmed that you want to use the model and you're ready to look at things in a little more granularity. Um, you can use our spreadsheet adoption tool, which is a little bit of a drop down and kind of expands as you select things to look at. And then more detailed considerations are also available in a data stewardship wizard instance, which I have also here. So this is hosted by Elixir. So Elixir and this were the two organizations that really helped us with the adoption tool. This is great. You just I'm already logged in, but you can create projects, and I see everything because I am in the I'm in the min, but you wouldn't see all that, so you could create your own. And there's nothing in here, so I'm happy to share one that might be for my organization, and you can select which ones are doing now, elaborate later, not relevant, and add content to each thing that is relevant to you. So that's a really nice tool that allows a little bit more of a form-fill experience, and then the visualization tool, which you've already seen. All right, so now I think we are mostly on time. Apologies if speaking too quickly was a problem there. Rory.
Could I just ask a thanks? This is all fantastic stuff of the various kind of enabling resources that are being developed for GORC, which you're describing, which I wasn't aware of. So this is brilliant. And one thing this is just marking for not for discussion now, but maybe something we can discuss. The one you showed, the last one, um, I think I'm just wondering whether we could make use of that or adopt it for Meldreth because we need something similar for Meldreth as we discussed in our session a couple of days ago. We're kind of the little sibling of Gorkin. We're behind in things like this. So I'm just marking this out for a topic for us to think about later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got connections that need to be seen between the two working groups anyway, so that could even be something that's a knowledge model added into this one. Um, Volmar Ekstrom and Lars, that's already on the call. They've been the ones really driving the work on the back end with this, as well as our colleague Kieran from the ARDC. So I think that that's definitely an avenue we can discuss. But yeah, so knowledge models is one way to add it in for sure. Nice. Okay, so we'll do more with that. So yeah, please do check out this data stewardship wizard. It's really helpful. I'm going to be using it for my organizational profile myself. Okay, so proposed changes to the model. We've got two main things that we'd like to discuss kind of in now in what I'm calling the meat of the meeting. If you do have questions, please raise your hand or put them in the chat. I'm very happy to answer anything about the things we've already talked about. But we're going to jump first into the GORC Module Task Force. There are some suggestions for how this is going to work, and Rory is going to bring us through a more detailed discussion of it. But the two main things to kind of preface it is, and also something discussed at Lawrence workshop, was that ICT infrastructure and services and tools, those two big essential elements that are part of the technical part of the model, they really should be reorganized into research enabling and research facing service essential elements. It's been remarked on ever since the model was first published that it was a little weird that these two things were separate essential elements, although it was recognized why one was a little bit more tangible in terms of you could literally touch like a server, and the other one being intangible but still very, very relevant and important, which would be like the delivery of a service or the availability of a tool. Um, so this is a relatively large change. It would be the renaming of an essential element or recategorization within the model, if not a renaming. And then splitting apart of these essential elements into those two facets of enabling or research facing. And then the second piece of this is what a tangible connection between GORC and Maldrith could look like for those research facing services and tools, and how they actually get connected to each other practically for use. The second discussion we'll have is on the representation of interoperability, and I'll do more introduction with that when we get to it. So for now, I'll hand it over to Rory. Rory, would you like to go through this? Do you want me to present on your behalf and click through, or do you want to share screen?
Probably easier if you keep sharing. I think it'd be quicker if
Sure.
that's okay. Yeah. So yes, hi everyone. So first of all, I'd like to give a shout out to CJ and to Chris Wu, both of who are on the US and Canadian, respectively, East Coast, but East Coast is the operative operative word here. And this is now the second time in whatever it is, 3 or 4 days that um, they seem to be both wide awake and actively participating in the middle of the night for a session. So thank you so much, guys. It's awesome. Um, yes. So the first of all, maybe just let me say who's been involved in this task force. This has been a very active task force. In fact, more active than in some ways than even the Maldrith group itself. Uh, and so CG and I have been involved, uh, and so has the others who've been involved are Chris, and then Maria Pretzelis and Natalie Williams, who are also co-chairs of the Maldrith group. But I think it's fair to say that Chris and Natalie are the ones who've really driven this task force. Um, and so, first of all, a big shout out to both of them. Natalie is not here because of the time difference. Uh, Chris, I feel like you should actually be going through these slides, and I since that wasn't arranged, I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you to do it. But just so you know that Chris and Natalie have made, I think, an amazing. This is was a really hard thing to do, and Chris and Natalie have kind of really gotten their teeth into it and figured out what we actually need to do and driven it forward. So I'm going to briefly go through a couple of slides to put some context, and then I think CJ, the plan is to actually have a discussion. And so, Chris, it'd be great if you could jump into to the discussion and perhaps even lead it if you feel up for it. Yeah. All right. So that's a bit of context. So as this says on the slide, I'm assuming here that everybody is pretty familiar with Maldrith, but very, very high level for those who aren't. The Maldrith map has at its base a version of the research data lifecycle with 11 phases of the life cycle, and then for each phase, three representative categories of tools that are often used in that phase were identified. So you go from 11, then you have 33 because you have, 3 to 1. And then for each of those categories of tools, three representative actual tools, or typically used or appropriate, or so thought the first working group tools are listed. So you go from 11 to 33 to 99. Okay. So that's really what it consists of. And there's a spreadsheet that has that. And then in addition to that, another one of the co-chairs of the Maldrith group, Adam Biles Moore, has created Prism, which is an interactive tool for both representing the map and also importantly um, building, putting in the ability to identify uh, interoperability between individual tools based on a number of interoperability parameters which the current working group has identified. Okay, so that's what Maldrith is. So you can see from that, if you're familiar with GORC, as CJ said, that there's also a listing in the services and tools element of the GORC of various things which are services and tools. So the idea is to see how these two things fit together. That's big picture. Um, so again, as CJ says, if you think about the kind of where these two models are coming from, Maldorf is focusing more on practical day-to-day tools that researchers use, where is GORC just not just in terms of its service and tools, but generally is taking a more broader approach, looking at generally speaking at behind the scenes services that make research possible. So hence the naming of researcher facing is a good way to capture Meldrith, and enabling is a good way to capture the GORC approach. So the purpose of the task force was and is to try to join these two things up together, um, to make it easier for organizations to decide when to use GORC or Maldrith, or how to use them together, to create some guidelines for their use, preventing duplication of effort, and maximizing benefits for the research community. Next slide, please. So that all sounded fairly straightforward before we started, but as we jumped into it, as always, things looked a bit more complex. And again, thanks to primarily to Chris and Natalie for bringing us back into after we got in deep into the woods for helping to bring us back into the open air. Uh, so some of it's not just the case that these are two lists of the same thing. That's kind of what we discovered or what we've been focused on. So as it says here, some of the GORC services and tools are behind the scene pieces that are needed to make research facing elements function well, i.e. enabling services. So they don't actually, if you're trying to map between the two, there's actually doesn't work easily because they're talking about two different kinds of things. Um, so at the Lorentz workshop last summer, we it was decided kind of as a kickoff to this task force that we would separate the GORC service and tools element into two parts and consider how they relate to ICT infrastructure, which is another one of the services and tools elements. Next slide, please. Um, yeah, so this pretty much says the same thing as I've already said before. This differentiation between researcher-facing services and tools, a tool that a researcher would actually or an end user would actually work with as they do their research, and enabling services and tools, which are probably not necessarily seen and almost certainly not actually actively used by researchers, but are there in the background that enabling researchers to do their work and oftentimes enable the researcher-facing services and tools to be deployed. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's all background. So what if we here's what so okay we've gone through this process and here's our recommendation. Um, we have looked at I think okay I thought there were supposed to be little arrows in this, but maybe I'm getting confused. Maybe there we go. Can you add the arrows? Yeah, that'd be helpful. Thank you. So researcher facing services and tools. Um, these are categories that are in the GORC services and tools element. This is the way there's slightly different terminology, obviously, between the models. So of the ones in of the service of the categories in service in the GORC services and tools element, the ones which we identified as being addressing primarily researcher-facing services and tools were research object repositories, discovery services, services and tools for direct research tasks, services and tools that enable workflows and middleware, vocabulary, and semantic object services, commons catalogs, research object management services and tools, and persistent identifier services. So these ones are appropriate to map with Maldrith because the Maldrith tools are, by definition, researcher facing. So they're in the same category. And then the services and the things which were in the Maldrith or which are in the Maldrith services and tools element, which we came to the conclusion were actually more enabling rather than researcher facing, and therefore need to be merged with the ICT service, ICT element are discovery services, data management services and tools, PID services, security and identification AI, and a help desk service. Um, Next slide, please. Right. Um, so this is more or less a visual representation um, mapped against the phases of the life cycle of what was in the previous slide. And I think, CJ, if I understood correctly, the plan is now to actually have some, I think next slide, please. I think the plan is now to have some discussion. Is that right?
Uh, yep. So there's already some discussion happening in the
And okay,
chat.
and as I said, over to you to because I wasn't sure exactly how you wanted to frame the discussion. So but thank you very much, everyone, and back to CJ and possibly also Chris.
So maybe because we're doing really well on time, yeah, Francois has a question. So we'll start with questions in from folks first about what's generally been happening, and then we'll maybe move into this kind of targeted questions we had for the group afterwards. So don't worry about joining the mentee right now. What I'll do is actually go back to the previous slide, and Francois, please go ahead.
Uh, Yes, it was on about the previous slide from this one. I am glad to see that discovery services are on the two sides, but with my repository hat on my head, I would suggest that research object management services can be on the other side too, because in a repository they are managed by by the staff, and they may not be seen by the users.
What sort of management services are you thinking would be enabling by the
The
staff?
thing the things which are managing the workflow inside a repository are certainly not visible from the users, hopefully. If you take the OAES schema, the starting point of everything, it's not on the user side, it's not on the visible side, on the other side, it's inside the box. So I have no objection to have it on the research facing, but I would like to see, because of my own experience, I would put it, and I see that Gilles agrees with that. Uh, I think it's the same thing in Recherche Data Gouv.
Okay. I'm I might make a quick clarification because I also see Gilles point on data management services. So obviously on a slide we couldn't put the entire definition. So apologies for the confusion there. But the research data management one is well, research object management is well taken, Francois. Thank you. The data management services that's listed on enabling services and tools,
Okay.
that is about the data moving through the commons, not research data, but like logistical or administrative data. So that's kind of what that's about is not really, it's about capturing what's occurring through the backend services. So just be clear, like I know there's two different usages of data here, and that's a little confusing, but that's also why the box is at the bottom of we need to make these more precise, we need to make these more clear. But definitely interested to hear if there's other interpretations to that because we do want to make sure this is more comprehensive and we have an opportunity to make it more comprehensive now. Um, Hervé?
Hi there.
Okay.
Yeah, to follow up on Francois's point, um, there's a and I'll probably follow this up with you afterwards anyway. But like, there's also in terms of modeling this through the whole life cycle, there is a design decision in there to make this to differentiate things as researcher facing, whereas another option is to think about this in ICT terms as human practitioner facing versus back-end services. Yeah. So when you think about the suite of tools that are used for data manipulation and metadata manipulation throughout the life cycle, there is a huge overlap between the tools that are used by researchers and repository practitioners. Yeah. So there is a split there between data and metadata facing tools directly and the underlining tools. And I think it's probably worth looking at things like FITSM in terms of IT service management to see how that pulls that view together. I just think that I just get the feeling looking at this proposed change that one, we've all got very different attitudes about services, which is why, IT service management and repository service management has got very different categorizations, but also the fact that just a split between researcher and non-researcher facing tools kind of leaves out those repository practitioners. And I think that in the end, maybe a little bit further down the line, you might find that becomes more of a challenge in mapping rather than less. Anyway, I'll have a think about that and follow up.
Oh, I'm also seeing more things in the chat. And so, no, please do bring forward like the concerns and other resources you'd like us to look at when we're considering this change, because the task force, as Rory's kind of highlighted with the number of people in it, there is only how many? 5 of
Five,
us, and so there's
five
not going to,
people.
yeah, there's 5 people. So thank you. And so there's going to be a limited number of perspectives. So the more that we can kind of take in and make sure that we are starting off on a better start is really helpful. And especially for resources to include, that's excellent. Francois.
Yes, I am trying to think about this in terms of the adopters of the GORC model. So does this make, I have been working on 2 adoptions on 2 different cases in the last months, and I am trying to understand whether this helps. There are things which are a bit difficult to know where to put what. And I have the impression that having in mind this faces the researchers, and this is what I put in front of the researchers, in front of the users. And on the other side, what is below, even if there are things which are on both sides, I have the impression it makes things easier because it's the real life of the GORC. There are things we push towards the users, and there are things we deal with inside. And even if they have 2 aspects on the 2 sides, it helps, I think, to separate them. So this is why I tend to think this separation, would you say separation, into 2 boxes can help eventually. But I don't know what the others adopters think about that.
I was thinking some other adopters might raise their hands, but I guess not. Uh, and it's also fine if folks are thinking about it. We can definitely circle back. Um, so maybe I don't. Oh, another hand. Harvey, go ahead. Oh, we can't hear you, or I can't anyway.
Oh, there we go. Too many mute buttons. So I need to go back through the Maldreth and have a look at how that looks at tools in terms of kind of like an IT service management perspective as well, and what that would kind of link to. In terms of adopters, I'm trying to be aware that I'm going to take a very repository perspective, as might Francoise. But in terms of national infrastructure service providers, they might be taking a step back and they just see a bunch of researchers and a bunch of repository people as roughly equivalent data jockeys pushing objects through a life cycle. Yeah. So I think that's another perspective to think about in terms of how those major national service providers think about all of this provision. But one way to look at this as well is that there is the temptation to have as flat a model as possible. So that top tier that you've got in the GORC at the moment, I think is highly relevant. And I did feel that there was value in separating out ICT provision from service provision. And because that lets you explore the complex interpretations of those 2 things a little bit more. Now, there might be a big justification for solving that with Maldreth as a tool layer, if you see what I mean. And I'd have to look again at what the compromises are on both sides there. But if you look at most of the GORC, they're broadly activities and functions. Yeah. The other gap is the digital objects. But those activities and functions, we're doing a thing on a project called Fidelis at the moment, where we're looking at some related stuff. And if you look at those activities and functions, then you end up with the variables against those activities and functions being the specific objects, the specific tools, and the specific services. So it builds that out into a little bit more of a matrix from the flat there. And I think the thing to look at is whether or not the Maldreth alignment solves one of those sets of linkages. And if it does, then that might be a justifiable way to do it. But I'd have to look a bit more to see whether that necessitates a split between ICT and services, or whether actually that could do Maldreth a favor by saying our tools have both a foundation of underlying IT, but can also bound up into a series of services and with service components and configuration items, etc. So I think that's, I'm just looking at this thinking the first step looks really logical in terms of mapping, but I'm just wondering whether or not it'll increase the complexities in the second and third step away from that in terms of adoption. That's all.
That's almost a segue into some of the plan discussions parts we have, but I do want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to voice opinions and also to get the things in the chat. So I don't see any more hands, so I just want to at least say out loud, so it's part of the recording, some of the things in the chat here. So originally, as I mentioned about data management services also being on the research facing side, and a distinction I want to make, and I might go back very quickly to the definition that was on a previous slide, is research facing does not mean researcher facing necessarily. I think that's probably a minimum maybe, but we can discuss that. But research facing is about a service or a tool invoked by the user to facilitate actual research action. So something that would be along that research life cycle. So things can still be researcher facing, like the actual user facing, like a help desk, which I see as part of the chat, and we'll get to that here. And they would still be offered to the researcher, but they're not really helping them with their research. They're answering a particular question, or maybe you do have something that's about research methodology, but ultimately the researcher isn't actually doing something in the research life cycle by going to that help desk. That's a clear example that we were able to find to kind of hone in on these definitions. So just wanted to clarify that, and I know having the definitions up and memorizing them while we're going through slides is not easy, but I just wanted to go back to that one. Oh, and that was the help desk example that Paula gave. Perfect. So that's, yeah, nice. Thank you. And collaboration foreseen on other fair enabling resources. We have a number of groups that we'd love to work with, is maybe the short answer for that, from the GORC perspective, and a lot of different outputs that we'd like to either ensure are, if not embedded, because the model is discipline and principle agnostic to the large degree that we can be. But I think that it makes sense to work with some groups to ensure that we're following the right protocol. So, Micah, that's a good suggestion to work with the fair enabling resources. I will look into that further, and we're happy to take in suggestions like that. Storage and compute services are provided to researchers, both have strong user and enabling components, like lab notebooks and whatnot. Yeah, so electronic lab notebooks is, Roy, this might not be a fair thing to say, Chris, this might not be a fair thing to say. I feel like it's a large part of Maldreth. And maybe that's just because there were so many examples of different electronic lab notebooks that are in Maldreth. And so I think maybe what we're getting to is what sort of enabling services would you need for those research-facing services? By making the distinction between them, we are not trying to remove the connection. And that's actually part of the work we're hoping to do in the task force, is to say which enabling services are required for which research-facing services, so that it would be easier in that adoption layer for folks to say, I want to implement an electronic lab notebook. What are all of the pieces I need for that in terms of enabling services themselves, but then also the ICT infrastructure that it lies on top of too. So I think that's a great comment. It kind of gets back to what Hervé was saying. And a couple of people saying that this would be a helpful distinction. So that's really excellent. Thank you for the positive notes here, folks, and asking some clarifying questions. That's really good. Okay, any reactions to what I've just said, some of those clarifying things? Any other comments from the folks that are on this task force right now, Rory or Chris?
Just to say that I think this discussion which we've just had is quite useful, and to encourage anyone who feels that they have the interest and the time to maybe also get involved in the task force.
Yes, definitely.
Right, perfect. So I think maybe what we'll do, just looking at the time and seeing we've only got about half an hour left, um, I'm going to maybe switch gears and say, for those that are interested and have the time, we had also created a Mentimeter to go through some of the big questions that the task force had right now on the connections between enabling services and the research-facing services that we've identified, but then also some of the tough questions we had on integrity and quality control and where those sat. And I think this might be getting to some of the points that Francois made around some things are handled both as an enabling service as well as the research-facing service, and that Hervé had as we don't want to leave out repository practitioners, research practitioners either, because that's sort of that gray area where you might have people doing a little bit of both. So I would encourage you to, I'm gonna put this in the chat as I say this, Aldrich GORC, task force mentee. I would encourage you to have a look at this Menti, and if you have time to go through it, it's a little bit long, which is why we're not going to do it during the session now, but you can think of it as homework. I don't need to be presenting for you to access this. You can go through it at your own pace and submit it whenever you have time. There's 30 questions in total, but those 30 questions are all very short, and it's just about selecting a couple of items in a radio button manner, in a multi-select manner. So please have a look at that if you'd like to have, if you can't join the task force especially, but in general, to have some feedback on how you feel about integrity and quality control, where that sits, if it's an enabling service or a research-facing service or both. We've broken them apart into the different kinds of quality control and quality assurance you can do. Really would appreciate your insight on that. We've been having a really hard time coming to an agreement on that in the task force. And the second part of the Menti, as I said, is the connection between enabling services and research-facing services. So for each research-facing service, what are all the enabling services that you would need to make it run? So please go through that. If you have the time and the capacity, we would love to hear your feedback. And you can also email me afterwards if you have any questions or concerns about it, if you want to add any additional comments or notes. All right, so we'll move on from there. So we're not going to do this. But that was part of the discussion. And this is just a reminder of what the multi-site life cycle is, because that's how we've been doing a lot of our mapping. Okay, so the second discussion that we were two out of three discussions that we were hoping to have today. And thank you so much for the insight on the first discussion regarding the connection with Muldreth. The second one is about the representation of interoperability. So for those of you that are in the working group, I think even in the interest group, we had sent out a number of notices about this, but we've had 2 dedicated working meetings and 2 focus group sessions in February, as well as an asynchronous homework document on how do we actually represent interoperability in the GORC outputs, and in particular in the typology and in the model. The other types of outputs we might create that facilitate adoption, they're a little bit more freeform and flexible because we're in the process of creating them. But how do we actually represent it in the diagram that everyone loves and uses, as well as in the model, which has been referenced a number of times? So this does address 2 different recommendations that were in the Lawrence Workshop Report, I6 and I7, and we talked about that a little bit earlier. So this is where these discussions came in and why we brought them back to the fore. So what we heard in the focus group sessions and in the working group sessions, and for folks that were in one or both of them, please do chime in, and I'll make sure to give lots of space for you to speak as well.
Oh,
Answering, Najat.
oh,
Yeah.
pardon, CJ. Just before we get to, oh, never mind. I see you responded to Nadia's question of how long the Menti is going to stay open for, but I just figured I'd ask now.
Yeah, totally. And I'll say that now. Actually, sorry. I'm flipping back for the screen. So yeah, before we actually go into what we heard, so the drum roll, please. How long will the Menti stay open? Right now it's open for 7 days because that's the default, and I was thinking we do it during the session, but I'm actually going to go back and extend it. I'll see how long I can extend it for. Maybe just leave it open because I think it would be cool for even to send to the working group or the interest group to get their feedback as well. So yeah, it'll be for a while, at least for a week, but ideally more. Okay, good question. So yeah, I'll keep going back and forth in the chat and seeing it. But thank you, Chris. Please do call my attention. All right, what we heard in these focus groups on the representation of interoperability. A really big component was really large changes. So structural changes to the model and typology will cause more harm than good. And I know this seems ironic because we've just been discussing in regards to Maldrith that we wanted to break apart and merge back together ICT and services and tools. However, I will preface this by saying that the splitting apart and considering research-facing services and tools and enabling services and tools and kind of changing those two essential elements, that was already something that had been identified and it mostly agreed upon, I think, in the Lawrence workshop itself. So this is more about, and we're not removing any information from the model. So there's no, like we're not taking things out. We are just changing where they sit. And we're changing the name of an essential element, but not necessarily its intended function. So that's one argument for the change through the Maldrith task force isn't quite as intense as something like this would be, which could be in removing interoperability as an essential element was one of the proposed changes, which would be quite large. So really large changes like removing an essential element, not just moving things between them or changing them around a little bit, would cause more harm than good because it's already in use. We need to make sure that it remains principle and policy agnostic. So there's lots of different ways that interoperability can be implemented. There's lots of different ways that it can be like aimed towards, but we need to make sure that the model is kind of at that more abstract layer of the concepts that could be considered and not necessarily the frameworks or blueprints that you would use to implement it. And lastly, a really big thing was that interoperability is a little bit of a weird essential element. It's not really a set of considerations of things that you can implement. Like if I handed you and said, this is technical interoperability, go implement it, you would then need to break it apart into other components and say, well, I need standards and I need to consider what kind of operating systems different things are using. I need to consider if the hardware is interoperable. We need to actually break it apart into other things that exist in the model. And so it's recognized that it's a driver for, so interoperability is a reason why you might use the model or go after doing certain considerations, but it's also an outcome of the other essential elements. So as you implement pieces of the model, you're aiming towards interoperability of a particular kind. Maybe that's in general, maybe that's legal and organizational interoperability, tactical, semantic, etc. So those are kind of the three main things we heard in the focus groups. And there are summaries in the asynchronous homework document that's linked in the slide if you want to go have a look at what people said both in those focus group sessions, the working group sessions, and asynchronously. But those are the three main points. All right, so what is the proposal? So after a lot of discussion, again, with the working group and then thinking about this within the co-chairship, this is what the co-chairship suggests for us to consider. And we're discussing it here for the first time as a proposal, and it'll also go to the working group for further consideration. So the first thing is we don't want to change the structure. We're not going to remove interoperability as an essential element or move it out of the model or move it out of the typology. But we are going to consider making small changes to things like the examples, the descriptions, and the sources to make sure that it's a more not maybe comprehensive, but a richer resource, and it's more clear what the intention of interoperability is. To get more towards that driver for an outcome of implementation of the rest of the model, instead of changing that within the outputs themselves, within the model itself, we'll create user documentation to highlight that central importance and that different perspective that interoperability has compared to the other essential elements. This might include some possible implementation approaches. So using some of the principles or policies that are relevant to a large swath of adopters, and maybe making different versions for different stakeholders, but not actually changing the model itself. And lastly, when we've got a number of things to change about the typology diagram, then we'll do a batch update. we have some icons that need to be changed. We've got some namings that needs to be changed, but those are pretty small potatoes. So when we're ready to do a larger update, say with the release of a GORC version 2.0 from the model, we might release a new version of the typology at the same time. That's when we would consider a big update. So not in the interim. So what I'd like to hear from this group is, how does this proposal sound? It's not a big flashy one. It's more about we need to create better user documentation and work towards these outputs. But also, what would you like to see in that user documentation for adopters or for people looking to recommend the model for their organization to use? And what would be most important in there? Yeah, those are my two main questions. But then, so I'm interested in hearing, what do you think about the proposal? Does that make sense? Is there other things you'd like to see us do in regards to the representation or use of interoperability? And where we're thinking of creating separate outputs to address the usage of interoperability specifically, what would you like to see in there to make that better? Francois?
It's a very pragmatic point, but I think it's, as you said, there are, and we saw that when we discussed, there are many, many aspects in interoperability, and this may also evolve. And so I think that the user documentation has to be checked to contain definitions of all the aspects of interoperability. And this can also have feedback towards the model, which is not changing things which are in the model, but eventually adding things in the model, which is a bit different, if needed, I mean. But one of the, just to make some relativization, do you say that, of the thing, I remember very well a very strong point during one of the subgroup meetings specific about interoperability, that the adopters will adopt and do what they need with the model. So it's clear the model has to be as good as possible and as understandable to, to, to work on the fact that people understand what is in the model, and then they will do what they want, in a sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that was one of the main reasons that we had kind of said, despite there may be being some benefit to moving interoperability out as an essential element or changing what it looks like, ultimately it's the adopters that we want to serve with this output, and it can be up to the adopter how they then treat interoperability. So, yeah, it was exactly that point that was really what I was thinking about when we were thinking about this proposal. Oh, this is interesting. So, in the chat, I don't see any other hands, so please raise hands as well if you'd like to speak to a point, but you can also add things in the chat. I'm monitoring that too. Um, Wanting to see in user documentation, the gap that the model is addressing. So what it helps with, absolutely. Big part of the value narrative. And then this is an interesting point, what the model is not for. And Francois's point of like some people might invent new usages for the model. We saw that during the Lawrence workshop as well. We kept coming up with more and more and more use cases. And a subset of them made it into the report as a reference because they got very well established and built out. But some things that we've even before at the beginning of creating the model, there were things that we kind of said, okay, this is not for this or that or the other thing. And since then, we've realized that it's an open output, and we can determine what some of the priority usages are, or what we've seen that is helpful in the community, or what people have asked us to help develop outputs to assist with. But it might not actually be the GORC initiative, like the working group, the interest group. It might not actually be our role to say what you can't use it for. It's out there to use in the way that's helpful. So I think that's an interesting point because there is almost like a feeling that you want to control how people are using it, especially to avoid negative outcomes. But ultimately, it is open source and out there for folks to use however they want. So it's a hard line to walk, I think. Hervé.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's a difference between what people go away and do with it, which is beyond your control, versus having like a designed intention for the model and a scope. Yeah. And I think, especially if you're talking to Maldreth, I think that's probably a super important conversation to have and a really difficult conversation to have because you're obviously both sitting there in the really complicated weeds of the detail, which is, I mean, given the people I can see on the call, quite often our favorite place to be. But maybe taking a step back and like looking at, so you're looking at interoperability, and I can't help thinking back at the ICT versus services thing. I think those three things together might imply a design decision for the two groups about what they expect to do and what they expect not to do. And this is what I mean about thinking kind of 3 steps forward into okay, where we simplified mappings between the Maldreth tools and the perspective that we've got for the GORC. But does this by design, an acceptable design, close off potential future mappings and granularity that should be handled elsewhere? Because some of this is, you know, unavoidably editorial. Do you know what I mean? You're gonna take a view on it. So I think that there is value in trying to work out what you're not trying to do, and maybe saying that out loud. You know what you're not trying to do or not trying to support, or where you think some design decisions might take. And I think that it's very, interoperability is like super complicated, super misunderstood very confidently, and understood very confidently in multiple different ways, often by everybody in the same room. And I think managing to interact between that and a view on ICT and a view on to ICT infrastructure, a view on products and tools, and a view on the service perspective, I think those things feel to me like they're kind of interactive design decisions. So looking back at your slide, I'm thinking, I don't know what to say about that first bullet point, because I think that whether or not you make major changes depends on maybe in a discussion between Maldreth and GORC at this point, because it could be the wisest thing to do. I'm honestly saying I don't know. It could be the wisest thing to do is to make a change now that makes things more flexible and effective later. So that's all.
Good, thank you. I think this highlighted for me, there was two different ways we could take what is the model not intended for. And Paula, my apologies if I think maybe Francois and I misunderstood. So I think from what Francois put in the chat, the way that we understood that question was the use cases that it can and cannot be used for, or who cannot and cannot use the model. But I don't think that's what it is. And Hervé, thank you for adding on to this. It's more about what's in scope and what's out of scope. Not who uses it, who can and cannot use it, because that's not something we can prescribe. But I think the scope question is very vital, and that is something that we have set to some degree in the groups to date. I think again, it's a model, it's not a framework, it's not a blueprint. An organization cannot only use the GORC model; it's a place to start, and then to kind of help guide asking those questions to help you decide which frameworks and blueprints are right for you, or build your own. Ideally not build your own framework, but which frameworks you might want to use to then build your own blueprint, which would be then highly context specific. So no, those are good points. And so I think that is an excellent point in terms of the user documentation of where does the GORC model end and other resources begin. And we may or may not recommend certain resources. We might have examples of resources in the model, which is something that already exists. But where does that start? What does that kind of begin and end? I think that's an excellent point. Yeah, Paula, thank you. Yes, so apologies that we immediately misunderstood you in the chat discussion. Francois, go ahead.
Yes, it's the about what Hervé was saying, that interoperability is a very complex beast and difficult to go through and so on. I think one of the things we see when we use the GORC model is that it helps to understand to get a to define a common vocabulary for the things we are doing or we should do. So I really think that giving a good visibility to interoperability with a good documentation explaining its different aspects, and as I said, eventually adding new aspects over time, I think it may help the adopters to think about what interoperability is for them and what they have to do, what they are currently doing, and what they have to do. I think what we see, and it has been explained by people who adopt it, is that the model really helps to define a common vocabulary, and this means also common to have concepts having a name which is shared by everybody.
Then I see a question in the chat from Nelja about because we asked current adopters about this on a practical level. Yes, I think we can. And I think the irony of that is we've heard from some adopters already on their perspective just in this meeting. So how we collect that is how we create almost a community of adopters is also something on our registrar in terms of maybe an adoption registry and then connection between them to kind of ask these more pointed questions. But that is absolutely something that needs to influence the work in terms of what would be helpful in user documentation. So thank you for highlighting that. Go ahead.
So I just say, yeah, good morning, good evening, everyone. Thanks a lot. This is really interesting. I'm just thinking of the national level I'm in and the complexity, but I would like to socialize GORC at some level because I know it's definitely the model everyone is looking for to identify gaps. It is this, through this meeting, the complexity is high. So I would use it as a very starting point to bring these discussions together. So I'll reach out to you, CJ, or maybe any adopters in this Zoom room now would have any kind of recommendations where to start. I would bring some players together within the disciplinary consortia that I work in Germany and just introduce the topic. And I think it's already the hexagons will help us enormously. And that's the beauty of it, to see the desired state we want to go into. And these granular discussions around interoperability will help, but they'll help later on. First, we need to kind of kick off the discussion. So the abstract layers, as just to reiterate the conversation before, is what will help us more than anything. So I can't contribute to these granular discussions yet. So that's just that, CJ. That's what I would ask you or anyone else to help me with in a presentation, or I'm sure there's plenty of slides I can use, but it's not to overwhelm the audience at the beginning. But all these issues we're grappling with, every single one of the hexagon parts is relevant to us, and I think this would really help us. It'll just take time and step by step. Yeah, and so we will take from it what we want, and some parts we won't take. So let's see. So I think asking your adopters would help as well. Thanks.
No, big time. That's a really good point. I will say that what we have been recommending, and I've now put this in the chat, it's also linked in the slides. The Lawrence Workshop report has an entire section on a recommended way of how you might consider adopting the model, which resources you would use, who you'd have in the room, and the kind of that step by step approach to make it a little easier. When you're ready to actually dive into the model, it's just as complex as it is at the beginning. But that's like step, I think, 6, and it's not step 1. So the first one is kind of thinking more about your purpose and why you're doing it and who should be part of the team and your methodology for doing it and that sort of thing. So I would highly recommend for anyone who's thinking of adopting the GORC, the model in particular, or using it in some way, to really follow the recommendations in the Lawrence Workshop report. But please do also reach out to us There's some really cool adoption tools that we've already highlighted that aren't going to be linked in the report because they came out afterwards, like the data stewardship wizard, and some of our narrative profiles that can help navigate it as well. So always feel free to reach out to me directly. And we are working on improving the wiki on the RDA website too, so that it can maybe be more concrete there. And as I said, there is also a task group working on user documentation. So ideally, we'll have some additional pieces that might be a little bit more. If you're in the national context, this is something you could consider. If you're in a discipline specific context, this is something you could consider. So thank you for that, Nelson, for bringing that up. And Francois raising excellent points. Um, but I think we're also some of your main points during the LARES workshop too, Francois. So I appreciate I appreciate that coming back to the fore again. All right, so looking at our last few minutes here, and this might be just part of the continuing discussion, but before we close, I wanted to kind of get this larger idea of what else. So we've talked about interoperability. We've done this excellent segue into the what else discussion, maybe. But I have a couple of probing questions here, or anything else that comes up, or people have thought about in regards to using the GORC outputs or things that would be useful. I think we've definitely heard working with adopters and hearing what adopters need, especially when it comes to that user documentation and support. That's a key one for sure. So we will want to do that absolutely in the next 6 months, really putting prioritization on that. Trying to keep track of all the adopters has been really difficult. So the adopter registry is going to move up into priority because it essentially lives in mine and Andrew Trillar's inboxes right now. And but if there's anything else that has come up either through this discussion or folks that are bringing in from a fresh perspective that we should consider in the next 6 months before our final plenary and as a GORC2 working group in October. This is the time because we only have 6 months left. +1 to our adopters registry. Perfect. I agree. Every time I get a new email, I'm like, I should have had this up already. All right, yeah, lots of people thumbs up in that. Okay, go ahead.
Do you have testimonials in your meetings? I mean, it's be useful to have people say from their national context in a couple of slides what they've done, where they started. I mean, every context is different, of course, but it would be useful to hear those voices, maybe. Suggestion in London or...
Yeah. Before I answer that, Francois, go ahead.
No, it's just to say that there was some kind of discussion of this kind during the plenary in Brisbane, I think. But it would be good to go back to that in one of the group meetings eventually. Or, sorry, Seiji, you should say that, but there can be presentations during the IG meetings about from an adopter, and then you can ask questions and discuss what happened. So I guess it's the things you have in mind somehow, Seiji.
Yeah, so I think the format is something that we would want to think about because we'd like to hear from many folks, but this is how we've been using the working group in the last few months. So we kind of took a deviation to talk about representation and interoperability because that discussion got started and we really wanted to move forward on it. But before that, we had started to not reopen the speaker series necessarily, but to start hearing from adopters and what their experiences were and what they kind of thought around some of these main questions we had around changes to the model or how it could be used. So we heard from Andy Gotts from PanOSC in December, which I think is kind of the first one. And then hopefully we'll hear from a couple of other national as well as international as well as pan-national contacts. So I'm not going to name names at this time because we haven't nailed those down. But we're hoping to hear from them over the next few months as well within the working group setting. But those are kind of whole working group meetings that'll be dedicated to that one adoption case to kind of hear the full story and discuss any barriers, challenges, suggestions, new ideas that come out of it. But Najla, that's a good point around having maybe almost like lightning talks. That might be an idea for the plenary in in London. That's a good point. So yeah, I'll make sure that that's noted down, and we'll think about that as we think of our proposal, which are due in May or April or something. The call for submissions for London's already open, folks, if you didn't know. I see from Michelle in the chat. Yes, visualization is a big one. That's something that keeps getting put on the back burner, but is critically important. Absolutely agree. And a simplified version of the model. So we do have, as I said, there's a number of adoption tools, and so it's something that we've been thinking about, but the narrative profile is the one that's the simplest, and then we've got the big model. So having an in-between layer, I think, is something we've heard a couple of times that is needed, and we've been trying to think about what that looks like, but I'm very open to suggestions on how that could look.
Yeah,
Lars.
just to expand a
Oh,
bit on
just
that, I
okay.
mean, yeah, I mean, that's the idea that when we started working on filling the GORC model for our institution, our research commons, I think one of the big feeling we got from people is that, oh, wow, that's huge. We will never have a time to get into it. So starting from something that could be incremental, like look at the big picture, fill the big picture, and then if you want details, you can go deeper and deeper and deeper. And once you get familiar with the model, it's easier to get deeper. But if you start by seeing the big adoption tool and then saying, wow, it's too huge, we'll never get into this, and then you get this kind of feeling which doesn't help with people that are not at the core of it. So if you want to get input from people, that would be, I think, very useful.
Thank you. All right, Lars, last comment, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Yeah. Quick comment then on the visualization and the visualization tool. It is downloadable as a Docker module. You can actually take it to your own institution so that it's not online. And if you have a DSV instance, you can you can connect those internally without having to sort of be working externally on some web page somewhere. I know that can be very useful for people who are working in organizational development that might not want to share their data out. And the other thing is that it's very much also open source. So anyone who wants to kind of look into, because I know that we didn't have time within the hours that we had allotted to us to really refine how the export could work. There's a really good export that exists, but it could be made better, and it could definitely be made helpful for sort of working with the simplified versions of instead of dumping out as much. So yeah, that is definitely something that people can take up and work on as they want to make a fork of the visualization tool. That it is, as I said, open source, and everything is available through GitHub. So feel free to explore it and post issues and comments.
Yeah, we'll do definitely, and we'll give feedback. Thanks very much for this.
Right. Thank you, folks. A couple of next steps on the slide there, but essentially, if you want any help with adoption or you're interested in joining the task force or task groups, please email me. Otherwise, join through the RDA website. We'd love to have you. And our next working group session will be in April. We alternate between Australia-friendly times and Europe-friendly times, with North America just suffering all the time. Jokes. The Europe-friendly one is actually both are pretty friendly for North America. We'll end in 2020. We'll end later this year in October. And with that, thank you so much. Join the groups. And this has been an excellent discussion. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you so much, CJ, and all of you. Very good session. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.